Welcome to lesson 3 of the crash course. In the last video, we covered the basics behind variables, and now we'll look to enhance our understanding by exploring numeric data types. So far, we've looked at whole numbers, or integer values, such as x equals 7. We just assigned x an integer value of 7. Let's also assign y an integer value of 3. And now, simply set z is equal to x divided by y. And we are going to output print z itself. This gives us not a whole number, but a float value. A float value uses a decimal to account for numbers with fractional values. That said, there are two Python data types that are used to denote numeric values: int for integer values and float for decimal values. Int and float. Int and float, since they are two different data types, will therefore have different operators and functions that work on these objects. We can use the type function to determine the data type of a certain value. For example, we know that x is for sure an integer, since we assigned it an integer value of 7. Let's test it out. Print type of x. And this prints out an integer type, which is what we expected. If I make this 7.0 and run the cells, it prints out floats, because now it is indeed a float value. A mathematical operation between an integer and a float will always produce a float. For example, 2 plus 2.5 gives 4.5, a float. 7 divided by 3.5, although mathematically this should give us just 2, the division operator is a special case, as it always results in a float value whether we're dividing by an integer or a float. So it will give us a float value of 2.0. If you print the type of the result of this operation, it will be indeed a float, as demonstrated. However, let's assume for whatever reason that you absolutely needed the product of this division to be an integer type. To convert this float numeric type to an integer, we can do so with the following syntax, by wrapping it with the integer data type. What this does is it will cut off everything beyond the decimal. So instead of 2.0, this will just be 2. And indeed, that's what the output reflects. If I set w is equal to an integer of 3.7, it's going to cut off the 0.7, and by outputting w, it will give us a value of 3. This can be useful if you are counting the number of people that voted, for example. You can't have 3.7 people, it must be a whole number. So the take-home message, if the result of the computation relies on an integer value, make sure it's an integer, like so. Accordingly, you can also convert an integer to a float by enclosing a variable with the float data type, which will simply add the decimal 0.0 to make it into a float value. So set some float is equal to a float of 3 and print some float. By doing so, we get a value of 3.0. Alright, that is the basic gist behind integer and float types. You'll come across these data types very often throughout this course, so it's very important to be aware of their distinctions. In the next video, we'll look at string data types.